Hello, welcome to another round of the Crazyhouse World Championship 2020. This is Mugwort, and we are jumping ahead to round 11 out of an 11 round, 12 player round robin. This is round 11, although chronologically speaking, it is actually only the 8th match that I've played, so I've skipped a few rounds. It's just a matter of pairing up with whichever opponent is free. So at the time of playing the match, I still have three matches remaining after this one has been completed. Now, of course, the audio recording is later than the actual match. That's why you don't see my lips moving, but the sound is coming out anyway, I hope. So my opponent here is VariantsOnly from the Netherlands, or Upper Land. And we had a previous match 2 years ago where I managed to defeat him 6 games to 0. But he has been my pick to be one of the biggest improvers for this year in the last 12 months. So I'm actually expecting quite a tougher match than a couple of years ago. So we already have a surprise with G4 against the Dutch on move 2. So I've taken, which is good, and I think I should play D5 here on move 3. So D5 is probably the only realistic chance of getting back into the game already. It seems a bit crazy to say that, but taking is no good because probably knight takes, and then the knight's coming to G5. There's a terrible weakness, of course, on F7, which has to be filled, and white has all the space and the activity for the pawn. But the way I've played this is really bad because it turns out to be just like a Catalan with G3 and bishop G2. But because of knight F3 and I'm worried about, again, the weakness on F7, I decided to cover it with a pawn. And it turns out I'm 2 or 3 tempi down on a normal Catalan. And white may even have the open F-file to work with already. So this is just a disaster in game 1. So I think somebody has played G4. I mean, it wasn't a total surprise on move 2. I used to call it the spike in chess, the spike gambit. I'm not really sure what it's called. But yeah, taking in D5 and then bishop takes D4. Otherwise, you just leave the pawn there as long as you can to prevent white developing knight to F3. So, do I have any chance at all to come back into the game? I didn't want to put the bishop on F5 for obvious reasons. It's just a sitting target on the F-file. So, E6. Some ideas to play bishop B4 to trade the knight on C3 and then knight E4 or the new knight on E4. And here possibly bishop D6 and invite pawn at E5, then I can sack the knight for 2 pawns. Because I'm expecting knight takes F7 and pawn at G5 or E5 anyway. So I might as well defend the E5 square a little more. There is a bit of a target on G3. Now my main problem from here is that even if I do get in bishop takes G3 and he sacks a knight, or he's the one attacking, I don't actually have any direct threats against the white king. Even pawn at F2 can be sidestepped, pawn at H2 can be sidestepped. So I need quite a lot of material to really make any impression on the white king at the moment. So I'm recording this a week later, so I may forget the exact moves, but I think it was knight takes F7 and pawn at E5. So he's doing exactly the right thing here. And then there may be even a sack on D5. After pawn at E5 and knight takes. So I didn't want to take with the bishop first, even though a white bishop can't be put on the board to check me, because the knight on E5 is very loose, can just be hit by bishop f4 or bishop at d4, for example. And at least there is a target on g3, although, as we're about to see, it doesn't really go anywhere. So the black king is never going to feel safe here, because there's always ideas of pawn at h6, take bishop takes, and knight at g5. So yeah, a move like rook f8 doesn't really work with the idea of tucking the king backwards to g8. Even if I had time, I'm still not going to feel very safe after that. I was hoping he'd defend g3, something like pawn at h2, or I don't think anyone in their right mind would play pawn at f2 as white. But again, he's doing the right thing to attack. I think the move is knight takes d5. And probably the last chance I had in this game was to go e takes d5, allow queen takes. Swap queens, bishop takes, pawn at e6, knight at g5, king e7, queen at f7, and I had to rely on the defense with king d6. Again, it looks completely crazy, but it is still complicated, and white has to find some accurate moves after that. But here, with knight at g5, I have no chance whatsoever, because the problem is I can't step backwards. There's two pawns, so he's winning the queen by force if I step backwards, and I have no counterattack. Even pawn at h2, knight at f2, rook takes, bishop takes. I'm going to need an extra move to check, and he's already got a queen in hand if I step backwards. So I have to go king g6, there's no choice, and just hope for the best. But yeah, the game was really decided in the opening when I wasted all those tempi. And the problem playing the Dutch against d4 is not so much that there's one forcing line which kills the Dutch, but the problem is that you just can't afford to make one slight mistake, because you can just be wiped off the board like this game number one. So e4, maybe not the best move. Queen d3 check, I think, was the best move to force me to defend by blocking with a knight. Otherwise, queen takes bishop on g3. Yeah, looking for something to do with the pawn, but there's really not much here. I have to get rid of the knight before he goes. Yeah, pawn at h5 was one of the main threats. So maybe I could step backwards to e7. King e7 was the last chance to survive, but still, it's completely winning. As long as white avoids a trade of a heavy piece, should always be winning. And queen g4 is a good finish with knight at f7. Alright, so very clean game from VariantsOnly. No real mistakes at all. But I can certainly make that more challenging if he repeats the line. So I don't know what you'd call this opening, but it's getting pretty popular because it does cut out a lot of black's options. So, you know, with normal developing moves, instead of bishop takes d5, like knight f3 or d4, there's a lot of patterns which players with the black pieces are used to, where sometimes the knight goes to f4 and attacks g2 early. Sometimes there's pawn at g4 to kick the knight away from f3. And this seems to sidestep all of those dangerous lines. So this was played in a previous match against Art of Deception from around 8, I think it was. And including knight at f4, I think I threw in the move pawn at f7 check too early. And it's a lot better to just go knight e5 in this position. So it doesn't give black really many options. Of course, I'm very happy with the queen trade because his knight is stuck on e2 and it takes a long time to clear it out of the way and make a threat. If knight takes g2, king d1, again, black is nowhere near from making any decisive threats. So here the main plan is simply pawn at f7, doing the moves in the right order, and knight takes c6 check, queen at e8 checkmate. So there really are very few options for black, and I think it is already lost. So at the time of recording, I do believe that Jusugi has finished all his matches, Jusugi 99, and he has a fantastic score of 85% against pretty decent opposition, average 25-50 or so. So congratulations Jusugi 99, who will qualify to play the final of the World Crazyhouse Championship against R11. And that will be a series of 3 times 20 games of 3+2. Played sometime over the next month or two. So VariantsOnly is trying to work out if he can escape this. So he hasn't gone for the queen. The problem is if he sidesteps with his queen now, for instance, queen d6, and that doesn't really help because pawn at d7 is coming anyway. The knight will take on d7 and then just step back out of the way, back to e5, and then there are 2 holes to cover on d7 and f7, which is just about impossible. So he could have perhaps done something like bishop at c4, which would have given me some options. And perhaps the safest move is just pawn d3 after that, to protect the queen on e2 and then keep all the threats. So knight at f7 is possible to stop castling and continue the attack. The simplest is just pawn at d7, check here. And after pawn at d7 check, there really isn't too much to comment on. So it may feel like a very slow game, this one. When you're playing a finite number of games and they all count, you do want to be absolutely sure of yourself. So this move doesn't create any real attack on c2. I can just move the knight backwards and then it's going to be mate very soon. So the match score will be 1 game all going into game 3. In fact, I've spent most of the time in this game thinking about how to improve on d4, f5, g4. But as we'll see, variance does not repeat g4. So yes, am I going to play f5 again? Maybe one more time, or we'll see if he's got something else. Knight c3. So this is a classic finisher opening. I've got in mind a few variations if he's looked up my previous games. So I've played c6 a few times. He'll probably just leave the pawn there and then come back to c3 after queen a5 check. The main move here is e6, black playing e6 and then bishop d2. If bishop c5, I think the sharpest move is to go e4, and then you're allowing black to sack on f2 and then just finding a way out of the checks. It's very dangerous if you haven't seen it before, and because of course you've got to be worried about too many knights and pawns in hands. There's a potential queen sack on c3. I do remember sacking a queen once on c3 against the finisher, and then I won that game. He looked it up and found some improvements. But this 6e5 I think has never been played before, is very dangerous. And bishop c5 doesn't really go very well with e5 because it leaves the pawn on e5 unprotected. even d6, he can just throw in knight d5 and then probably have to give up the queen for the piece. But the next move I played is just absolutely terrible. It's just a silly blunder. I should have played knight c6. Even then, I'm probably not even getting 2 pieces for the queen if knight d5. The tactics just don't favour black at all if I haven't played knight c6 and the pawn on e5 is unprotected. So then I forget about knight takes e4, in which case I don't even get 2 pieces for the queen. It's just a tragic blunder, but yeah, bishop c5, although it looks good at first. It just doesn't work out. This is already lost for black. There's no way I can sack the queen on d2, or f takes e4 is just too risky because bishop takes e5. Bishop takes a5, and then there's queen at d8 chair, queen takes h8, and I don't even have any threats after e takes f3 and picking up 2 knights. And of course there's pawn at f7 check any time in these lines too. So, okay, I invited on myself playing the Dutch, but I think I'll have to give up this line. And it doesn't help to play a few inaccuracies in a row after playing such a risky opening. So castling is pretty much forced. Of course I'm hoping to have time for something like bishop takes e3 and pawn at f2. At least that would give me some hope, but it's not going to happen because white is just going to generate too many threats already. So trying to remember the move in the game, was it knight e5? Yeah, and the big threat is pawn at f7 check. There's another pawn in case king h8 gets mated by force with queen at g8 check. So I have to play a very sad looking move, pawn at f7. Don't even get a chance to go bishop takes e3. But yes, we can skip to the next game pretty much because it's already lost. I mean, it sort of feels at first that at least black can survive a few moves, but a very accurate play from here. Bishop c4 renews the threat on f7. And even if I defend it with a knight, he's still crashing through. I mean, this blocks the bishop on e7, and I can't play rook e8 because probably just queen at d8 and then take the rook and mate on f8. So trying to defend with the bishop backwards, but already pawn at e7 is too strong. So can survive a few moves by putting a new bishop on c5, for example, but even then, queen at e8 is just absolutely murderous. So just like me in game 2, he's taking his time to make sure that there's no counterplay and everything has been accounted for. Bishop takes queen at e8 check is the idea, and mate with queen takes f7. Alright, 2 games to 1. Looks like it's going to go with the white pieces mainly in this match. I'll try not to be the first player to buckle. I'm a bit surprised, considering how well the opening went in game 2, that we have a repetition. This time a new move, pawn at e4, pawn at c4 is very well known, because the idea of renewing the pawn chain with c6 just doesn't work, because of knight takes d5 and then a decoy into a fork with knight at c7. So this is a funny looking move, bishop at e5, and I think it's only been played once or twice. Possibly Jasugi has played it with black. Not exactly sure. The two main moves seem to be knight f3 and pawn at f4. So just having a look at knight f3, bishop g4 to see if I have anything good after bishop g4. Anything better than just h3. And possibly knight e to g5, opening up the e-file. Pawn at f4, I think. I don't know why my mouse is hovering over d4. It's tempting him to play queen takes d4, then knight f3. It doesn't seem like such a great idea though. So pawn at f4. So this bishop on e5 is just floating there in mid-air. It's just a very strange place for a bishop to be. And most people's natural instinct playing with the black pieces will be to block on the e6 square because it's so well protected. Either with a pawn or a bishop, and allow pawn at f5, just give the bishop back. And now we have the knight floating in mid-air on e5. So I've played it well so far. The move here is bishop at c3. And the main idea, well, of course you're hitting the knight, but you want to stop pawn at d4. And bishop at c3 helps to keep the queen on the e-file. Whereas this move I played in the game, bishop at g3, allows this intermediate move, pawn at d4. I mean, it's still okay. There's really nothing wrong with allowing the queen to be pushed around a little bit. Queen f4, bishop d6, as played in the game. We'll come to that. But bishop at c3, just a little bit more accurate. And hopefully obvious that the black knight cannot move because of knight f6 double checkmate wherever it goes. So it's either put the pawn on d6 or bishop d6, or intermediate move, as already said, pawn at d4. So I think it's already a new position after nine or 10 moves. So queen f4, I'm still reasonably happy with the white position here, expecting either knight g6 or bishop d6. Was okay with trading queens, queen takes c7, picking up a pawn because the knight covers the queen drop on e2. And of course the bishop on c7 does come with a threat. Although it's possible he has, I've got to be careful, he has a queen at e7. It doesn't come with check if there's a knight still on e4. So bishop d6. Have the option to trade and then replace. If he takes with the pawn, then possibly either knight at h5 or knight at d5. With some weaknesses on c7 and e7. I've got to be very careful though if I'm giving up a knight, because d takes c2 and knight at d3 is very hard to stop. So that's the main danger for white in this position, allowing d takes c2. So the move that's necessary here for white to keep the advantage is queen g5. And it not only leads to a very powerful attack if g takes, then knight takes f6, with ideas of pawn at g7 of course, but it comes with the sneaky threat of knight takes h7 and queen takes d8. So trading on d6 is not necessary. And that knight could really sting on d3 after c takes d6. Now, I had a complete brain slip here because I actually thought he had to block with the queen after bishop check and didn't realize he still had the knight in hand. So this is just a terrible oversight and it leads to a absolutely lost position. I mean, after I saw knight at e7, I thought, oh, maybe I still have something with knight at d5 and threatening bishop takes e7. But it's just way too slow after d takes c2. And it's, of course, it's very hard to guard the square d1 after that. So, yeah, this is a bit sad now. Knight at c2 check coming. Yeah, it has to be stopped, and then I don't really have any good moves after c takes d3. Yeah, no good knight drops. Alright, that was a bit sad. Because the queen sack was completely unnecessary, and yeah, simple move. Queen g5 would have kept a big advantage. So, losing one game with the white pieces hurts, going 1-3 down. And we're going to more mainline openings with knight c3 and bishop g5. Intending to push an early h6 g5, bishop g7 castle. And just going to wait for white to play either h4 or bishop d3. And I think in this game, yeah, he plays h4, g4. So still fairly well known. The idea of knight h5, giving up the g4 pawn. Exchanging on g3 to get a bishop in hand, which is very useful to put back on the h7, b1 diagonal to keep the king safe, but also to set up potentially attacking on c2. So I think bishop at g6 is possible, but I prefer to trade on g4 because the queen on g4 can be a little bit vulnerable. So assuming white wants to cover the pawn on c2, but there are many attacking ideas for black involving either sacking a piece on d4 or even putting a knight on e5 just to gain time on the queen. And once that pawn on d4 is gone, there's very common ideas of pushing d5, d4. And sometimes you take back with the queen if you can. And then big holes to take advantage of on f2 and e3. So bishop at d3. I was thinking about potentially sacking, but I think it's not so good if c2 is covered many times. In some lines I think you can go knight takes d4 and knight at e3, but it's not so good here. So pretty happy with knight at e5, just sacking a piece, and black is going to push forwards with d4 after take queen d1. He can also refuse to take, and then yeah, just think about if I want to trade on d3 or possibly knight b4 as an idea. I'm sure he's looking at ways to sack the queen on g6, but it doesn't seem to work. The h file is still closed, he hasn't had time to push h4, h5, and the main idea, all this comes with tempo, that justifies the piece sacrifice. Now, white has some issues on the dark squares, as mentioned, f2 and e3. And pushing d4 is the way to go. Not sure there's really any other good moves. Maybe knight takes d3, and depending which way he takes, then push d4 or pawn at e4. Okay, here we go. It's going to get exciting because really white is barely holding on in this position. If he makes one mistake, black is going to have an overwhelming advantage. And you see after queen takes there are no discovered checks. And pawn at f2 is extremely dangerous. If white plays pawn at f2, black will just go pawn at e3 and then take with the queen. So what is the move here? Did he go bishop takes g6? H4, h5. Okay, so here the correct move is to take on c3. It's a little bit counterintuitive to allow him to take back and bolster the dark squares a little bit. But if he does respond b takes c3, then just pawn at f2 check. And king takes, knight at g4 check, king e2. And bishop takes d3, c takes. And probably just knight takes d3 after that. Because there's no way white wants to take and swap queens. So still retaining an overwhelming advantage with the king stuck on e2. So the way I'm doing it here is not too bad with d takes e3, pawn at d2 check. I really want a knight for c1 or d4 or f2. So I'm looking at neither knight takes d3 or knight takes g6, but decided the safest move is to cover the king with fg6, cover the light squares a little bit, open the f file for rook f2. And one potential idea is rook f2, knight g4, and then even if g4 is covered, there's a queen d4 mate at the end. So bishop at c4 check. I didn't want to block the f file, so king h8. Of course I have to watch out that h6 is covered. And I should keep reminding myself that I never want to move that bishop on g7. Pawn at f4, it's a decent idea to block the f file. I think trading on c4 is good. And I should notice that white only has knights in hand after knight takes c4, bishop takes c4. Tempted to go for the knight immediately with pawn at d4, which I think is still quite reasonable. Maybe he could ignore it and go knight at g5. Some ideas of knight at f7 check, but I think pawn at d4 is reasonable. I think the best move is knight takes c4 as played in the game. And because white only has knights in hand, this is the moment to go bishop at g4 check. Very simple move, forcing white to block. Pick up the knight, bishop takes f3. If pawn takes, then knight at c1. And it's actually mating if the rook takes, and then promote to knight with check, do everything with check. So I did play bishop at g4, but unfortunately I took the wrong knight. No, this is tragic to watch it back, because bishop takes f3 check was just crushing. Keep the bishop on g7. I didn't remind myself enough times that I had to do that. So, what now? I mean, maybe bishop takes f3 is still good, or perhaps pawn at f3 to block the h file. But this is just way too dangerous. No need to do this at all. I had that crazy idea to play king g7, but was worried about rook takes g6 sack and then knight at e5, and he's got so many knights and pawns. So the game is still alive, but I've just thrown away my advantage completely, hoping to pick up some material back with knight takes h6. But yeah, white is actually better here because the knight is pinned, so I'm blocking. So he has to take the knight, but he's allowed. Knight takes g4 check. I've got 2 seconds. I've missed it. Oh no, Mr. Mate in 4. It was with knight takes g4 check. Free queen. That was really terrible. So I could have hit back immediately, and yeah, if I win the next one, possibly even up the scores at 3-0. But this is a tragic finish. I'm missing a very simple move. I mean, it was the whole idea of pawn at g7 to block out the pin on the knight on f6. So you could have just sidestepped with queen h4 or swap the bishop for the knight on f6. Right, it's just hopelessly lost after knight at e6. Yeah, very sad. Pawn at g7, knight at h6 is coming. Alright, gone 4 games to 1 down. Have to fight back. So So I'm expecting not to see the same opening again, but we'll see. Knight f6, knight c3. Is it going to be 3 times in a row? I hope he's got a new idea this time. Bishop at e7. Alright, so Art of Deception played this a couple of times. No, actually, this is a repeat of game 2, isn't it? A repeat of game 2, knight at f4. Queen takes, knight e5. So I really don't know what VariantsOnly sees in this position, or why he's repeating. So surely in game 2 he had a new idea. He wouldn't go for this otherwise. And I thought after knight takes g2 check, there was just no counter-attack for black whatsoever. So perhaps he's going to take the queen this time. But if he takes the queen, he also needs to give a queen. Pawn at d7, I shouldn't waste any time thinking because it's the most obvious move. There's nothing wrong with it. Intending just to play knight back to e5 no matter what. And it seems the only way out is for black to castle queenside, which is what happens. So then I have to make a decision. Do I play queen at a8 check immediately? Do I take on e2? Is there another move like knight at c6 to provoke a hole on b7? I think there's no way I want to play a move like knight at f7 and go for the rook, because then his counterattack could be dangerous. So looking at a line like queen at a8 check, queen at b8, take, knight at c6, he probably doesn't want to allow a hole on b7, so king a8, knight takes d8. And then it seems like he has to block the threat of rook at c8. So, yeah, probably putting the queen back on b8 or c8. And I've picked up a little bit of material. Is it enough to win? But you decided knight at c6 is a lot more forcing, because now it does come with a direct mate threat. So... yeah, what choice if he doesn't take on c6? Really not a lot of choice. Queen at a8 just looks disgusting. I don't think he's going to go for that. And obviously knight takes d8 is a good response. Yeah, so expecting b takes and then queen at a8 check is the idea. So, for example, bishop at b8, knight takes c6. With threats of queen takes b8, so this king is going to have to go for a run and ending up on d7, d6. And knight at b8 is also possible, but I think a knight's even better for me, because then I can move the knight back to e5, king d6, put a new knight on f7 check, force the king out to c5, and then look for a mate. But usually you don't want to play bishop at b8 because it weakens the light squares too much, and then see after queen takes c6, then there's already 2 threats on b7 and d7. So knight at b8. Yeah, pretty obvious move. Knight takes c6. So it does stop the mate with knight takes a7 and queen c6. But of course, as already mentioned, there's a drawback to dropping with a knight. Yeah, so it's really all over. No good defense. What's the best move he could do to survive? Queen at b6, something like this, but I'm happy to trade all the pieces. So there's only desperation left, but it really should be a mate in 6 or 7 or something like this. Queen takes b8 check, 95. So what's the fastest way to do it? Actually, there's knight at e5, pawn at c5, and queen b4. But I missed the mate in 3. But yeah, it's perfectly fine too. New knight on f7, king c5. What's the fastest mate here? b4 check, king d4. Or perhaps pawn at b4 is faster. King d4, d takes c3, knight, king e4, and knight at g3 to cover f5. But I'm going to do it the slow way. Queen takes c7 check. Just because I notice he can't go to d4 and e4. Queen c6 check, because I want to take the knight on c3 with check. Just to absolutely make sure that there's no funny business going on with any counterattacks. So bishop at b4 was the move in the game. Knight at b7 check is probably the fastest way to mate. Idea king a6, queen c6 check, and pawn at b5. And if he steps to a4, there's also queen c6 check anyway, and pawn at b3. Alright, so let's get on with the next game. And surely he wasn't happy with the previous d4, d5 opening. Yeah, that did look crushing with the king sitting on e2, and then all I had to do was take the right knight on f3 and then knight at c1 check, and it was game over. But very silly of me to move the bishop on g7 and allow the counterplay along the h-file when there was no need to do it at all. But we do have a completely different position on move 2, so I played f6. Not going for this early h6 g5 because, of course, from White's point of view, there are many different move orders. There's no need to repeat with h4. There's also bishop e2, bishop b5, bishop d3. So this is one of the most interesting positions already after move 5 we've had in the match. Offering 2 pieces for a queen, but I don't think it's so good with d takes e5, already threatening queen at g5 check. So just move the bishop back is sensible, queen d3. So ideas of queen b5 check is the most obvious move coming. And if c6, I thought his idea was to play queen to h3 with targets on e6, and if I defend that, then I'm going to watch out for the loose bishop on h5. I think I'm pretty happy with the response queen c8 because it covers both b7 and e6. And without any trades, there's really not a lot that White can do from here. I had a quick look at a6 to prevent queen b5 check, but again, didn't like the look of queen h3. I just don't like to leave the bishop loose on h5. And of course I can always take e5 anytime I want. So I'm expecting g4, and then we trade pieces on e5 and h5. And I'm already looking ahead at e5 to e4, hitting the queen after that, and where the knight belongs, probably f5. So f5, just gaining time on the bishop on h4, also eyeing off the pawn on d4. And just simple developing moves. Knight c6 coming. Not sure where the other knight goes. Maybe even h6. It's not so clear whether I should move the knight from g8 to f5 or put a new knight on f5 yet. It's the sort of ideas I'm looking ahead towards. I just felt a little bit too loose to take on d4. What was wrong specifically, I'm not entirely sure, but what happens? Queen takes d4, knight c6, bishop at a4, for example. There's possibly knight at f5 after that. It feels a little bit more secure with the hold on f7, not to trade the pawns. I thought I was doing quite okay after 8 moves with black here. But surely he's expecting knight at f5 to come, and he's figuring out a way to defend everything. Oh, this is okay, just block with the pawn. May come back to bite me later, but at the moment it's okay. Yeah, so as predicted before, queen h3. And there's no direct attack though, so yeah, I'm really not sure about this move. I think perhaps knight h6 is a little bit more accurate, and then move the knight to f5 and keep the knight off the board, because pieces are running into each other. So I'm not entirely sure what the purpose of this knight on g8 is. Didn't want to play knight f6 and allow a trade. So what's wrong with knight takes d4? I'm sure there was a good reason. Probably just castles queenside and the knight is hanging, but maybe it was an option. Oh, was it knight takes... Some knight takes d5 in response. Not sure. So the way I'm playing is okay. It's just a little bit of a weakness on c7, which actually doesn't need to be covered. So if I play knight e7, allow knight at c7 check, and then could even perhaps move the king and then go knight f5 and take on d4 or take on c3. It's very messy to calculate this though, because if I'm giving up a rook on a8 and it doesn't work, then it's just yeah, totally stupid. I even had the idea to sack the queen on c7 and castle, but I decided to play for material equality. But knight a6 also feels a little bit shaky. So finally developing the knight on move 16. Coming back with knight c7 to defend. Although even then, maybe bishop takes c3 was an option to attack. Because if his knight moves and there's knight at e2 check, perhaps I should be spending a move here playing rook g8 just to make sure g7 is covered. Because when he takes the pawn at e5 is going to sting. g7 is very weak after pawn at e5. So I thought, okay, I've burned all my bridges. I just have to put everything into the attack. Yeah, maybe rook g8. It's just so tricky with 5 seconds left. So put everything into the attack. Sack on b2. You probably should have taken. I don't think there's enough for a mate. Bishop at b4 is good. I really need to play pawn at f3 check next. And then the idea is to take on f6, allow queen g7, king e8, run to d7. And it's actually completely safe from all directions. Amazingly, these knights on c7 and e7 keep the king safe. And see, the more white trades in that case, the more holes he has on e2, g2. But yeah, pawn at e2 check was a mistake because it gave white an extra pawn that he needed to promote on h8. Whereas it's a lot better for me if the original queen was on and he didn't have an extra queen to sack, because obviously this is way too much for black to cover. Yeah, so definitely had a lot of chances in that game, but well played variants only to avoid the trade. It was a really tricky position when for so many moves bishop takes c3 was an option, but always had to watch out for knight at d6 check, and then there was a knight at c7 check before that, and then knight takes e6 check to watch for. A very complicated game, and very unique with all this queen c8 and queen h3 stuff. I felt like I should have done a lot better though in that game. Alright, we have a repetition from game number 4. I played pawn at f4, and then he sacked a piece with, pawn at d3 and knight c6. So this time, trying something new with knight f3. And even then wasn't completely sure what to do after bishop g4. So I could possibly get greedy and allow bishop f3 and take back with the g-pawn. So for example, if I play knight eg5 and bishop f3, queen e5, queen e7, bishop e7, gf3, or is that just too much? And then there's a big hole in g2. So he didn't play the expected move, bishop g4. Yeah, it's possibly another choice to grab a pawn with c4 and then allow bishop f3, gf3, knight at g2, king d1. Still wasn't entirely sure what happens on pawn at d5 after that, if I have to give the piece back, or whether queen a4 keeps the piece. But we have a completely different position to what I was expecting. So the move here is simply pawn at f4. And we get a similar position as before, but I think possibly even better, because he's perhaps not going to have a chance to play pawn at d4, as happened in game number 4. So queen d5 is a good move. The queen's not going to be hanging if there's any sack on f7. And it's not so easy to find the best move for black here, but it's just to ignore the threat and to counterattack with bishop to c5. It's a very unusual move. So knight takes d5, bishop takes e3. And this comes with the all-important threat of mate on e2. So e2 has to be covered by, for example, castling kingside, and then there's ideas of bishop takes g5, knight takes, possibly sack on h2 with the bishop. Queen c5. I mean, I didn't even see bishop c5 in the actual game, only after the game. So queen c5. Still, there's some danger for white after castling, because he has again got the idea of sacking a bishop on h2. If I take back the queen on e3 with the f-pawn, then there are some weaknesses on the dark squares like g3, f2, h2. So I'm expecting queen takes, f takes, bishop h2, knight takes h2, pawn at g3. And my idea was to bring the knight back to f3, knight h to f3. And then try not to trade many pieces until I can do a decisive sack with, well, knight takes f7, for example. And it's very easy to miscalculate something in these long lines. And I'm not sure if black has a lot of choice, because otherwise I just sack on f7, exchange queens, look for an opportunity to put the knight to g5, the queen to f7, and see if I can pick up a piece somehow with a sequence of checks. So he's gone for exactly what was expected. Knight takes h2, and king takes maybe possible as well, but it's not so nice to have the king drawn out. So he needs to accomplish a bit more than just picking up a pawn, because there's still no direct threat as long as the knight covers h2. Bishop at d5 I think was the most accurate, but this is still quite decent. Bishop at h5. I'm hoping he's going to block on g6, and then I really have nothing to be concerned about with the attack on the white king. I can possibly sack on f7, knight takes f7 after that. So knight e5, interesting deflection. I mean, I can even allow him to take on f3, go knight takes. But I just notice I have a check on b5, and then yeah, he's got an awkward decision. Does he just let the knight hang? Does he bring it back to d7 and allow bishop takes f7 check? Looks decisive after knight e6 and knight d5 check, and then possibly a double check on the f-file. So he gives up the piece, and maybe I have a force mate, but it doesn't matter because I'm just checking and intending to take back the pawn on g3, so I'm not going to miscalculate anything. Take the rook next turn, and it should be game over. So still got a bit of catching up to do. Scoreline is about to be 3 games to 5. Alright, see if I can finally convert when I have a decent position with d4, d5 out of the opening. So I've had 2 pretty reasonable games with the black pieces. I just made some mistakes in critical moments. And going back to this early h6, g5, expecting variants only to vary on move 7, move 8, something like this. So e3 castle, we had h4 in a previous game. And this time bishop d3, so I'm going to hit that with knight b4. So I'm quite happy to trade the bishop and put it back on maybe g6, maybe h5, maybe f5, we'll see what happens. So take bishop at h5 looks quite okay for black. Yeah, expecting just pawn f3. And then I'm looking for ideas to push forwards with c5 and d4, or what else is typical? Knight e4, maybe not in that exact position. Perhaps bishop f5 first. Alright, so queen b3 is a little bit unusual. Could try to defend solidly with c6, but I do like this move, c5. So partly trying to undermine the defense of the knight on e5, but mainly just want to push forwards with d4 and open up the position again. His king is a little bit more secure compared to game number, was it game 5? So h4, this time I do have a choice. I mean, taking on h4 is not too bad. Taking on d4 looks good. So main idea after e takes is to stick the pawn on f4. Because I'm quite happy with bishop h2, that blocks the h-file even more. And then possibly follow up with knight g4 after that. Of course, looking for opportunities to play pawn at h3 or pawn at f3, some disruptive move. So pawn at f4, I'm not expecting him to retreat. I'm expecting a more aggressive move like h takes g5. Intending to take the bishop, f takes g3, f takes g3, and then yeah, this really provocative move, bishop at e3. So it may not come with any direct threats. So move 15, f takes g3 and bishop at e3. And I think there was nothing wrong with taking on g5, h takes g5. But yeah, maybe there's some lines where he can castle queenside, or perhaps pawn at g4 at the right time and open up the h-file. Alright, so, but here white really has to spend a few defensive moves, like pawn at f2, because yeah, he can't allow these holes on d2 and f2 to stay there for too much longer. I was half expecting e takes f6, and then I was thinking which piece to take. There's bishop d4, there's e f6, bishop f6, all look quite reasonable. Probably e f6 just because it hits the knight on e5. If he wants to go rook takes h5, then that's okay. Pick up the knight, and ideas of playing bishop g4 and putting pawn on f2, knight on d2. Alright, so he's blocked out a diagonal from h5 to d1. I think that's the main idea, protecting d4 as well. So looking at h takes g5, and simply want to dump the pawn close to his king. Now the danger here for black, of course, is if the h-file is open, then always got to watch out for the h7 square. Seems most sensitive, and perhaps even if I trade the bishop on h5, then pawn at h6 is something to watch for. So he has spent a couple of moves in defense. Pawn at d2. And knight takes, I was even looking into bishop takes d4, and because that, once I undermine the knight on e5, that means he's got a sack to make any progress if he wants to counterattack. So this move may seem dangerous, bishop takes f3, but there are some real threats after bishop takes d4. Alright, this is just complete madness now after knight takes d5. Turns out the most accurate move is simply to ignore the bluff and go bishop takes e5, knight f6 check, bishop g takes f6, bishop at h7, king g7. And then after knight at h5, I can even step into the fire with king takes h7, knight takes f6, double check, king g6. It was too hard for me to calculate, but I was actually completely safe, and white is running out of pieces. What else is possible? I didn't want to go knight takes d5, although that's what I did in the game. Expecting bishop at h7 in response, but no. The move here is pawn at g2 check, king takes a knight at e1 check, king f1. And then what's hard to see, well, extremely difficult when you got 8 seconds, is that I have time to play a totally calm, sober move, bishop to f5, because white's only real threat is to put a diagonal piece on h7. Well, especially a queen after the queen trade. But bishop f5 also comes with the sneaky threat of bishop takes d3, check, and pawn at g2, and that was just way too hard to see given the time. But Variants has found a way to come back. I mean, even if I didn't see that, there were still other ways to defend with bishop f5. But no, I just got no defenders on the light squares. And the knight on h6, it covers the square on f7, but they're just not covering enough squares. So Variants has taken over. So this was quite a a bold attack with knight takes d5, sacrificing a knight. But yeah, there were many resources for black which I just didn't manage to find in the time scramble. So Variants will take the match. It's 6 games to 3 with 1 to go. Let's see if I can recover the last game. But surely we're going to see a different opening here. E4, knight, c6. Alright, so there's no way we're going to get the same opening again. Because if he plays d5 here, then I'm not going to go for bishop c4. I don't think it goes so well with after you've already played d4 because of the response bishop b4. Yeah, so the bishop is much better placed on b5 if black goes bishop b4. There's no danger in knight at b2, for example. So black can sack the queen on h4. It's quite decent. Otherwise, play pawn to f6 or pawn f6 or pawn at e7. It's perhaps a little bit too passive. So pawn at e5, I think, is the most aggressive move. Of course, you can always put the pawn back on b2 to protect everything on the queen's side. But then black has the option to trade for the bishop on d2 and put the bishop back at the right time. So it's either bishop takes c3 or the most aggressive move would be e takes f6. And knight takes d1 doesn't come with an immediate threat, so you can just keep chomping the pawns on g7. Yeah, so expecting g takes f6 in response. And now I think taking on c3 is good. Because if knight takes c3, I'm not sure about the move order, but I can take on c6 check first, or knight at g7 check first. King f8, step the knight back to h5, and if rook g8, then only then save the queen with queen d3. And the bonus is that it hits h7 as well as c3. So bishop b4 may not be the most accurate move. And probably queen d3. It looked okay at the time though. Alright, so what's wrong with knight takes d2? Probably nothing. Knight takes d2, queen takes d4 is what I was most concerned about. Because the mate on f2 is covered, I can answer queen takes d4 with a brilliant move which I only saw later, which is knight at e7. Double attack on the rook on g8 and the knight on c6. I didn't see that at the time, but we're going to revisit that idea a little bit later. So king f1 instead. Again, seemed okay at the time, but now I've got to watch for pawn at h3. I'll be careful how much material I give away, especially diagonal pieces for h3 and g2. So here the move is knight at h6, the most accurate move, knight at h6. I didn't play that because I didn't see what to do after rook g6. But I can actually go knight takes d2, I think, after that, because then if rook takes h6, then I have... Oh no, sorry. The move after knight at h6, rook g6 is knight takes e5. That's the idea. Because then if rook h6, then I have the mate with bishop takes c6 check and knight at g7. So that's what I missed after rook g6. Not so easy to find over the board. But this is quite decent anyway, knight at e7. Bit of an unusual fork because most people there would rather put a pawn on e7 than a knight, but May as well take advantage of the loose pieces on the board. So if the rook moves, I'm hoping for knight takes c6 and then bishop takes, and I can clean up the other knight on e4. And otherwise, the best black can do is to sack the queen for 2 pieces. Not a lot of option here. I don't think pawn at h3 leads anywhere. I might even be able to play g3 in response, but surely just taking the rook is good. H takes g2, take it back, pawn at h3, king g1. So expecting a queen sack on e7. And also rook takes g2 can just be ignored by taking on c6, knight takes c6, for example. Alright, here we go, bishop e7, and now VariantsOnly could have tried bishop h3, bishop to h3 instead of king takes e7, because now he has to defend the threats on f6, which is quite awkward, because eventually the king is going to have to step on in the line of the bishop on b5. That means I can always take on c6 with check when it's to white's advantage. But okay, still a little bit tricky after bishop h3, because queen at e7 check doesn't seem to get anywhere. King c8, and then what? I can play pawn at d7 to distract the bishop, queen f7 maybe. Still not that obvious it's easily winning. And the knight on e4 stops the check on c5 with the knight, so I'm not entirely sure what the best move is. Maybe rook g1. I decided to play safe and go pawn at e6. And the main idea after f takes is to go queen at f7 check. And even then I'm still not sure after pawn at e7, queen takes e7, king c8 what's happening. Is pawn at d7 check enough to win? Or should I include bishop takes c6 before? Anyway, it's taken with the bishop, so now I think it's quite safe to take on d2, go for a discovered check. And if he avoids it, then I take on c6. That's what I was waiting for, and knight at c5 is mate. So that's it. Final scoreline is 4-6. Well done, VariantsOnly. He's got revenge from 2 years ago. So, very exciting games, especially when I had the black pieces, because there are many opportunities in games 5, 7, 9. Certainly I got wiped off the board in the 2 Dutch games, but try not to let that happen again. Okay, thanks for watching everybody, and see you next time.